Have you ever been so certain about something that you were willing to risk everything, even your reputation, even your safety, just to prove you were right? I have. And let me tell you, standing up at a funeral filled with the most powerful people in the country and screaming that the deceased woman lying in that casket wasn't actually dead was the most terrifying and exhilarating moment of my entire life. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and I was the personal assistant to Victoria Ashford, one of the wealthiest and most influential women in the world. What I'm about to tell you sounds like something straight out of a thriller movie, but I swear on everything I hold dear that every single word is true. This is the story of how I discovered that my boss had faked her own death, and how that discovery nearly cost me my life. It all started on what should have been just another ordinary Tuesday morning, but nothing about that day would turn out to be ordinary at all. I still remember the exact moment when my phone rang at 6:30 in the morning, the shrill sound cutting through my sleep like a knife. I grabbed it from my nightstand with trembling hands, my heart already pounding, because nobody calls that early unless something terrible has happened. It was James Ashford, Victoria's husband, and his voice was shaking so badly I could barely understand him at first. "Sarah," he said, and there was something in his tone that made my blood run cold. "Victoria is gone. She died in her sleep last night. The doctor just left. I don't know what to do." The phone nearly slipped from my fingers. Gone? Dead? Victoria Ashford, the woman who had more energy than 3 people combined, who never slept more than 5 hours a night, who had just yesterday been discussing her plans for expanding her business empire into 3 new countries? It didn't make sense. Nothing about it made any sense at all. I told James I would be there within the hour, threw on whatever clothes I could find, and drove through the early morning darkness with my mind racing and my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. Victoria had been more than just my employer for the past 7 years. She had been my mentor, my friend, and in many ways the mother figure I had lost when I was just 16 years old. She had plucked me out of a dead-end secretarial job at a failing real estate company and given me a chance to be part of something extraordinary. Working for her meant 14-hour days, constant travel, impossible demands, and very little personal life, but I had loved every chaotic, exhausting minute of it. She taught me about business, about negotiation, about reading people and situations with the precision of a master chess player. She showed me that being a woman in a male-dominated world didn't mean you had to play by their rules or dim your own light. Victoria Ashford never dimmed for anyone, and she taught me not to either. When I arrived at the Ashford estate that morning, the massive iron gates were already open, and there were several cars parked in the circular driveway that I didn't recognize. The house, a sprawling Mediterranean-style mansion that sat on 15 acres of perfectly manicured grounds, felt different somehow. The air itself seemed heavier, darker, as if the building itself was mourning. I parked my car and practically ran to the front door, which swung open before I could even ring the bell. It was Margaret, the head housekeeper who had worked for the Ashfords for nearly 20 years. Her eyes were red and swollen, tears streaming down her weathered face, and when she saw me, she just shook her head slowly and pulled me into a tight embrace. "I can't believe she's gone," Margaret whispered against my shoulder, her whole body shaking with sobs. "I just saw her last night. She seemed fine, Sarah. She seemed completely fine." I held Margaret for a moment, trying to process the surreal nightmare we had suddenly found ourselves in, and then I gently pulled away and asked where James was. She pointed toward the master bedroom on the 2nd floor, and I climbed those sweeping marble stairs with legs that felt like lead, each step heavier than the last. The bedroom door was partially open, and I could hear voices inside, low and serious. I knocked softly and pushed the door open to find James sitting on the edge of the massive king-sized bed, his head in his hands, while Dr. Robert Harrison, the family physician, stood nearby with a clipboard and a deeply troubled expression on his distinguished face. The bed itself was perfectly made, as if no one had slept in it at all, and there was no sign of Victoria. "Where is she?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. James looked up at me with hollow eyes that seemed to have aged 10 years overnight. "They already took her," he said flatly. "The mortuary came an hour ago. I couldn't stop them. Everything is happening so fast." I felt my chest tighten with panic. Something about this entire situation felt wrong, felt rushed, felt orchestrated in a way that made my instincts scream warnings I couldn't quite articulate yet. Dr. Harrison explained that Victoria had apparently died of sudden cardiac arrest during the night, that James had woken up around 4 in the morning and found her unresponsive beside him, that by the time the emergency medical team arrived, she had been gone for at least an hour. "But Victoria had a healthy heart," I protested, hearing the desperation in my own voice. She just had her annual physical 3 weeks ago. She showed me the results herself. Everything came back perfect. She was in better shape than most women half her age. Dr. Harrison gave me a patient, condescending look that I had seen doctors give countless times to people who didn't want to accept difficult medical truths. "Sometimes these things happen without warning, Sarah," he said in that calm, clinical tone that felt like ice water down my spine. "Even in people who appear to be in excellent health, the heart is a mysterious organ. We'll know more after the autopsy, of course." But there wasn't going to be an autopsy, as I learned moments later when James informed me that Victoria had explicitly stated in her will that she did not want one performed under any circumstances, that she wanted to be buried quickly and without unnecessary medical intervention or delay. This was the first real alarm bell that went off in my head, loud and insistent. Victoria was a woman who questioned everything, who demanded second and third opinions on even minor medical issues, who had once fired a dentist for not explaining a procedure in enough detail. The idea that she would specifically request no autopsy, that she would want to be buried quickly without thorough investigation, was completely contrary to everything I knew about her character and her methodical approach to literally everything in her life. I wanted to voice these concerns right then and there, wanted to grab James by the shoulders and make him see that nothing about this made sense. But looking at his devastated face and trembling hands, I couldn't bring myself to add to his pain in that moment. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe grief was making me paranoid and unable to accept the simple, tragic truth that sometimes people we love just die without warning or reason. The next few days passed in a blur of funeral arrangements, phone calls to Victoria's vast network of business associates and friends, and the constant presence of lawyers and financial advisors who seemed to descend on the estate like vultures circling a carcass. I threw myself into the work of organizing everything, because it was the only way I could cope with the overwhelming sense of loss and the nagging feeling that something was terribly, fundamentally wrong with this entire situation. Victoria's death had made international news within hours. "Billionaire philanthropist Victoria Ashford dies suddenly at 52" read the headlines, and my phone didn't stop ringing for 3 straight days. Everyone wanted details, wanted to share their condolences, wanted to make sure they were included in the funeral service that was being planned for the following Saturday at the Cathedral of St. Mary, the massive Gothic revival church where Victoria and James had been married 28 years earlier. As I went through Victoria's office to gather materials for the memorial video and photo displays, I started noticing things that didn't add up. Her passport was missing from the safe where she always kept it, even though she hadn't traveled internationally in the past month. Several of her most valuable pieces of jewelry, items she wore constantly and cherished deeply, were also gone. Her laptop, which usually sat on her desk and which she guarded more carefully than anything else because it contained sensitive business information, was nowhere to be found. When I asked James about these missing items, he seemed distracted and irritated by my questions, brushing me off with vague explanations about how Victoria had probably moved things around, or perhaps donated some jewelry recently. But I had been Victoria's assistant for 7 years. I knew her habits, her routines, her systems better than anyone. She didn't just move things around randomly, and she certainly wouldn't have donated her grandmother's emerald necklace or her mother's diamond bracelet, both of which were missing from her jewelry box. Have you ever had that feeling where you know something is wrong, where every fiber of your being is screaming at you that you're being lied to, but you don't have any concrete proof yet? That's exactly how I felt during those days leading up to the funeral. I started going through Victoria's calendar, her emails, her phone records, anything I could access to try to understand what had been happening in the weeks before her death. And that's when I discovered something that made my heart nearly stop. 3 weeks before her supposed death, Victoria had made a series of very unusual financial transactions. She had transferred significant amounts of money, we're talking millions of dollars, to offshore accounts that I had never seen before in all my years of handling her financial paperwork. She had also purchased a small villa in Portugal under a corporate name that didn't match any of her existing business entities. And perhaps most disturbing of all, she had been in contact with a private investigation firm that specialized in helping people disappear, in creating new identities, in essentially erasing themselves from their old lives and starting fresh somewhere else. I sat in her office at 2 a.m, staring at these discoveries on my own laptop screen, my hands shaking so badly I could barely type. Why would Victoria Ashford, a woman who had everything anyone could possibly want, who was at the absolute peak of her power and influence, want to disappear? What was she running from? Or was she running towards something? The pieces were starting to come together in my mind, forming a picture that seemed absolutely insane, but also horribly perfectly logical. I spent the next 2 days investigating as quietly and carefully as I could, not telling anyone what I had found, not even my best friend or my sister. I reviewed security camera footage from the estate, interviewed staff members under the guise of preparing memorial materials, and dug deeper into Victoria's recent activities. What I discovered shocked me to my core. In the weeks before her death, Victoria had been secretly meeting with someone, a woman I didn't recognize, at various locations around the city. They had met at coffee shops, in parks, in the private rooms of expensive restaurants. I managed to get a partial license plate number from one security camera and traced it to a rental car company. But the records had been scrubbed clean, professionally and thoroughly. Victoria had also been taking regular trips to a medical clinic in a neighboring state, a facility that specialized in cosmetic procedures, but also, as I discovered through some very careful online research, in helping clients alter their appearance more dramatically for various reasons. The attending physician at this clinic, Dr. Elena Vasquez, had a reputation that existed mostly in whispers and encrypted forums online. She was known for helping people who needed to change their faces, their identities, their entire physical presentation to the world. This was not a doctor you went to for a simple facelift or Botox. This was a doctor you went to when you needed to become someone else entirely. The funeral was scheduled for Saturday at 2 in the afternoon, and by Friday night, I was absolutely convinced that Victoria Ashford was not dead, that she had staged the entire thing, that she was out there somewhere, alive and free and starting a new life while everyone who had ever loved her mourned a corpse that I was becoming increasingly certain was not actually her body in that casket. But I needed proof. I needed to be absolutely sure before I did anything as crazy as what I was planning to do. So on Friday night, I did something that could have gotten me arrested. I broke into the mortuary where Victoria's body was supposedly being prepared for the funeral. I had helped make the arrangements, so I knew the security codes, knew the layout, knew exactly where they would be keeping her. The building was dark and silent when I arrived just after midnight, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst right through my chest. I disabled the alarm system using the code I had memorized, and I made my way through the dimly lit corridors to the preparation room where Victoria's casket was waiting. My hands were shaking as I approached the expensive mahogany casket with its brass handles and silk interior. I had to know. I had to see for myself. I lifted the lid slowly, the hinges creaking softly in the oppressive silence, and I looked down at the body that was supposed to be Victoria Ashford. And that's when I knew, with absolute certainty, that I had been right all along. The woman in that casket looked like Victoria. I'll give them that. The resemblance was remarkable, probably achieved through a combination of finding someone with similar features and some expert cosmetic work. But it wasn't her. I had stared at Victoria's face almost every day for 7 years. I knew every freckle, every line, every subtle asymmetry that made her face uniquely hers. This woman's nose was slightly different. The shape of her ears wasn't quite right. And most tellingly, she was missing a small scar on her left eyebrow that Victoria had gotten in a childhood accident, a scar she had told me about and that I had noticed countless times when applying her makeup for important events. This was not Victoria Ashford lying in this casket. This was an elaborate, expensive, almost perfect fake, but a fake nonetheless. I stood there in that cold, dark room, staring at this stranger who was about to be buried under my boss's name, and I felt a rage building inside me unlike anything I had ever experienced before. How dare she do this? How dare she put us all through this pain, this grief, this mourning for someone who wasn't even dead? How dare James be complicit in this deception, standing there playing the grieving widower while knowing the truth? How many people were in on this conspiracy? And most importantly, why? What could possibly drive Victoria to fake her own death and disappear? I closed the casket lid and left the mortuary as quietly as I had entered, my mind racing with plans and possibilities. I could go to the police, but what would I tell them? That the body in the casket looked similar but not identical to my former boss? That I had broken into a mortuary based on a hunch and some circumstantial evidence? They would think I was crazy, grieving, unable to accept reality. I could confront James directly, but if he was part of this scheme, he would just deny everything and probably have me removed from the premises and possibly committed for a psychiatric evaluation. No, I needed to do something public, something that would force the truth out into the open where it couldn't be hidden or explained away. I needed witnesses, lots of them, and I needed to create a situation where they would have no choice but to investigate properly. The funeral was tomorrow afternoon. I had less than 14 hours to prepare myself for what I was about to do. Saturday morning dawned gray and drizzly, the kind of weather that felt appropriate for a funeral, and I dressed carefully in a black suit and heels, my heart racing with anticipation and terror about what I was planning to do. The Cathedral of St. Mary was already filling with people when I arrived an hour before the service was scheduled to begin. There were celebrities, politicians, business tycoons, philanthropists, society figures, and media representatives from around the world. Everyone who was anyone had come to pay their respects to Victoria Ashford, and the cathedral was filled with elaborate flower arrangements that must have cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. I took my seat in the third row, close enough to the casket to see it clearly, but not so close as to be immediately restrained when I made my move. The service began with a string quartet playing one of Victoria's favorite pieces of classical music, and then various speakers took the podium to share memories and tributes. James spoke, his voice breaking with emotion that I now believed was entirely fabricated, about losing the love of his life and his partner in all things. Victoria's business associates spoke about her vision, her brilliance, her generosity. Her college roommates shared funny stories from their youth, and all the while, I sat there with my hands clenched in my lap, watching that closed casket and knowing what was really inside, feeling the weight of the truth pressing down on my chest until I could barely breathe. The final speaker finished, and the priest stood to begin the closing prayers that would precede the procession to the cemetery. This was it. This was my moment. If I didn't act now, that fake body would be buried, the conspiracy would be complete, and Victoria would successfully disappear forever, while everyone believed she was dead. I couldn't let that happen. I wouldn't let that happen. I stood up abruptly, my movement causing several people near me to turn and look with confused expressions. "Stop," I said, and my voice came out stronger and louder than I expected, echoing through the massive cathedral. "You have to stop this right now." The priest paused mid-prayer, looking at me with shock and concern. James half rose from his seat in the front row, his face going pale. "Sarah!" he hissed. "Sit down. What are you doing?" But I was already moving toward the aisle, already walking toward that casket with every eye in the cathedral locked on me. "She's not dead," I announced, my voice ringing out clear and certain across the stunned silence. "Victoria Ashford is not dead, and that is not her body in that casket." The gasps and murmurs that rippled through the crowd were like a physical wave. Someone screamed. Several people stood up. James was pushing his way toward me, his face now twisted with anger and something that looked like fear. "You need to open that casket," I continued, speaking quickly before anyone could stop me, before security could drag me away. "You need to look at the body closely, at the scar that should be on her left eyebrow and isn't there, at the ears that are shaped wrong, at the nose that's slightly different. That is not Victoria Ashford, and I can prove it." I reached the casket before anyone could stop me and threw the lid open with both hands, the brass hinges protesting loudly. The crowd surged forward, everyone wanting to see, and I pointed at the body with a shaking hand. "Look at the left eyebrow," I shouted over the growing chaos. "Victoria had a scar there from a childhood accident. This woman doesn't have it. Look at the shape of the ears. Look at the nose. This is not her." Security guards were running down the aisle now, and James had reached me, his hand closing around my arm with bruising force. "You're having a breakdown," he said loudly, for the benefit of everyone watching. "The grief has made you unstable, Sarah. Come with me. We'll get you some help." But I wrenched my arm free and climbed up onto one of the pews so everyone could see me, so I couldn't be easily removed. 3 weeks ago, Victoria transferred millions of dollars to offshore accounts, I yelled, addressing the crowd directly. She purchased property in Portugal under a fake corporate name. She was meeting secretly with a private investigator who specializes in helping people disappear. She was visiting a doctor who helps people alter their appearance. None of this is grief or delusion. These are facts, and they deserve investigation. The cathedral had erupted into complete chaos now. People were shouting questions. Cameras were flashing. Security was trying to reach me through the crowd, and I could see several people pulling out their phones to call what I assumed were lawyers, police, or journalists. Dr. Harrison had pushed his way to the casket and was examining the body with a stunned expression that told me he saw exactly what I was talking about. A woman near the front was screaming that this was sacrilege, that I should be arrested. James was shouting at the security team to remove me immediately. And through it all, I stood on that pew, breathing hard, my whole body shaking with adrenaline, knowing that I had just set something in motion that couldn't be stopped or undone. Have you ever been in a situation where you knew your life was about to change completely, where you knew that nothing would ever be the same again, but you also knew with absolute certainty that you were doing the right thing? That's how I felt in that moment. Terrifying and exhilarating and right all at the same time. The police arrived within minutes, which suggested to me that someone influential had made a very urgent call. They cleared the cathedral, cordoned off the casket as a crime scene, and took me to a small office in the back of the church for questioning. I told them everything, showed them the evidence I had compiled on my phone, explained about the missing scar and the facial discrepancies. They listened with skeptical expressions that gradually shifted to serious concern as I laid out all the pieces of the puzzle. They brought in a forensic specialist who examined the body and confirmed what I had said about the scar and other identifying features. They obtained Victoria's dental records and discovered that the teeth in the corpse didn't match. Within hours, the investigation had exploded into a full-scale criminal inquiry involving the FBI, international law enforcement, and financial crime specialists. The body in the casket was identified as Maria Gonzalez, a woman who had died of natural causes 2 weeks earlier at a private hospital in Mexico, and whose body had been purchased by intermediaries working for what turned out to be a vast conspiracy. James Ashford was arrested that evening, though he never admitted to anything, and immediately hired the most expensive legal team money could buy. Dr. Harrison lost his medical license when it came out that he had falsified the death certificate without ever actually examining a body. The investigation uncovered that Victoria had been planning her disappearance for at least 6 months, that she had help from at least a dozen people, including her husband, and that she had created an entirely new identity, complete with documents, financial accounts, and a detailed background story. But finding out about the conspiracy was one thing. Actually finding Victoria was something else entirely. The next 3 months were the most intense and frightening of my life. I became the central witness in a massive fraud investigation, which meant I also became a target for people who wanted to keep Victoria's disappearance a secret. My apartment was broken into twice. I received threatening phone calls from blocked numbers warning me to recant my story. Someone tried to run me off the road while I was driving home from the FBI office one night. I had to enter a witness protection program, change my phone number, move to a secure location, and basically put my entire life on hold while investigators tried to unravel the mystery of where Victoria had gone and why. The why became clear relatively quickly once forensic accountants started digging into her business dealings. Victoria's empire, which had appeared so solid and successful from the outside, was actually built on a foundation of fraud, embezzlement, and financial manipulation that dated back more than 15 years. She had been running essentially a sophisticated Ponzi scheme, using money from new investors to pay returns to older investors while siphoning off millions for herself. When federal regulators had started looking more closely at some of her recent deals, she had realized that it was only a matter of time before the whole house of cards collapsed. Rather than face criminal charges, prison time, and the complete destruction of her reputation, she had chosen to disappear and start over somewhere else with the hundreds of millions of dollars she had already hidden away. The woman I had admired, had loved like a mother, had trusted completely for 7 years, was a criminal who had stolen from thousands of people and had been willing to fake her own death and break the hearts of everyone who cared about her to avoid the consequences of her actions. Learning the truth about Victoria was like having the ground open up beneath my feet. Everything I thought I knew about her, about our relationship, about the life we had built together was revealed to be based on lies and manipulation. Had she ever really cared about me? Or was I just a useful tool? Someone naive and loyal who would help maintain her facade of legitimacy? Had any of it been real? The mentorship, the friendship, the moments when she had seemed to genuinely care about my well-being and my future? I spent weeks in therapy trying to process the betrayal, the anger, the grief for someone who wasn't actually dead, but who I had lost nonetheless. Meanwhile, the international manhunt for Victoria continued. Investigators traced her to Portugal, where they found the villa she had purchased, but she had already moved on by the time they arrived. There were reported sightings in Brazil, in Thailand, in Morocco, but each lead turned out to be either false or just barely too late. She had planned this so carefully, had created such an effective escape route, that it seemed like she might actually get away with it. But she had made one crucial mistake. She had underestimated me. She had assumed that I would accept her death at face value, that I would grieve and move on like everyone else, that my loyalty to her would prevent me from looking too closely at inconsistencies. She didn't count on the fact that the very qualities she had valued in me as an assistant, my attention to detail, my refusal to accept things at face value, my stubborn determination to get to the truth, would be the same qualities that would ultimately expose her scheme. 8 months after the funeral, I got a call from an FBI agent named Rachel Chen, who had become the lead investigator on Victoria's case. "We found her," Rachel said without preamble. "Or rather, you found her. She's been arrested in Buenos Aires, Argentina. She was living under the name Isabella Romano, running a small art gallery, and she would have stayed completely under the radar except she made a mistake. Victoria had been unable to resist the temptation to continue the kind of high-stakes business dealings that had been her addiction for so many years. She had started investing in Argentinian real estate under her new identity, and one of her business partners there had recognized her from news coverage of her death and the subsequent investigation. The partner had contacted authorities, and Victoria had been arrested at her gallery on a Tuesday afternoon while showing abstract paintings to a group of tourists. She was extradited back to the United States 3 weeks later, and I was there at the airport when she arrived in handcuffs, flanked by federal marshals. Our eyes met across the tarmac, and for just a moment, I saw a flash of something in her expression that might have been regret, might have been acknowledgement, might have been respect for the fact that I had been the one to unravel her carefully constructed plan. Or maybe it was just my imagination, a desperate attempt to find some meaning or connection in the ruins of everything we had been to each other. Victoria Ashford went on trial for fraud, embezzlement, conspiracy, and faking her death to avoid prosecution. The trial lasted 6 weeks and was a media sensation. I testified for 3 days, recounting everything I had observed, everything I had discovered, and the moment at the funeral when I had made the choice to speak up rather than let the lie continue. Victoria was convicted on all charges and sentenced to 25 years in federal prison. She showed no emotion when the verdict was read, maintaining the same calm, controlled demeanor that I had seen her display countless times in high-pressure business negotiations. James received a lighter sentence because he cooperated with investigators, but his reputation and his fortune were both completely destroyed. Looking back now, almost 2 years after that shocking funeral confrontation, I can see how that single moment changed the entire trajectory of my life. I lost my job, my career, my sense of security and purpose. I spent months dealing with legal proceedings, threats, and the psychological trauma of discovering that someone I had loved and trusted had been deceiving me so completely for so long. But I also found something I hadn't known I possessed: courage. Real, genuine courage to stand up for the truth even when it was terrifying, even when it meant standing alone against powerful people and overwhelming social pressure, even when it meant acknowledging that I had been wrong about someone I had believed in so completely. I learned that trust, once broken, leaves scars that never fully heal. But I also learned that those scars can make you stronger and more resilient. I learned to question everything, to look beneath surfaces, to never accept things at face value just because someone in authority tells me to. I learned that the people we admire, even the people we love, are capable of profound betrayal. But that doesn't mean we should stop trusting or loving. It just means we should do so with our eyes open. The experience taught me that loyalty is a beautiful quality, but blind loyalty is dangerous. That you can honor someone's memory or legacy while still holding them accountable for their wrongs. That sometimes the right thing to do is also the hardest thing you'll ever do. And that being willing to stand up and shout the truth in a room full of people who don't want to hear it is a rare and valuable form of bravery. I eventually got back on my feet professionally, though it took time and a lot of hard work. I now run a small consulting firm that helps companies improve their internal oversight and fraud detection systems, using everything I learned from my years with Victoria to help prevent others from becoming victims of similar schemes. It's satisfying work, meaningful work, and every time I help uncover financial irregularities or questionable practices before they become full-blown disasters, I think about that moment in the cathedral when I made the choice to speak up. I still think about Victoria sometimes, wonder what she thinks about in her prison cell, whether she has any regrets about the path she chose. I wonder if she ever truly cared about me, or if I was always just a pawn in her elaborate game. I've had opportunities to visit her in prison, to ask her these questions directly, but I've never taken them. I don't think I want to know the answers. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. Some doors are better left closed. What I do know is this: that day at the funeral, when I stood up and yelled that she wasn't dead, when I climbed onto that pew and laid out the evidence for hundreds of witnesses to hear, I was acting not just on facts and logic, but on something deeper, something instinctual. I was acting on the accumulated knowledge of 7 years of working alongside someone, of observing their habits and patterns and ways of being in the world. I was acting on the understanding that comes from truly knowing someone, even if, as it turned out, I didn't know them as well as I thought I did. And I was acting on the fundamental belief that the truth matters, that it matters more than comfort or convenience or social propriety, that it matters enough to fight for even when you're terrified and alone and everyone thinks you've lost your mind. Have you ever experienced something similar? Have you ever had to stand up for the truth when everyone around you wanted to believe a comfortable lie? Have you ever trusted someone completely only to discover they were hiding something massive from you? I want to hear your stories, your experiences with betrayal, or with finding the courage to speak up in impossible situations. Share them in the comments below because I've learned that these stories, these testimonies of survival and resilience and choosing truth over comfort, are how we heal and how we help others who might be facing similar challenges. Understanding what happened to me, understanding the full scope of Victoria's deception and the conspiracy that enabled it, is important not just for my own closure, but because it illustrates how fraud and manipulation can happen even in the most seemingly legitimate and successful organizations. It shows how people in positions of power can exploit the loyalty and trust of those around them to maintain elaborate lies for years. It demonstrates why we need strong oversight, why we need people who are willing to ask hard questions and look at uncomfortable truths, and why we should never be so blinded by admiration or affection for someone that we ignore evidence that something is wrong. If this story has touched you, if it's made you think about your own relationships, or your own willingness to question authority and conventional narratives, then please leave a like on this video. It helps the algorithm share this story with more people who might need to hear it, who might be in situations where they're seeing things that don't add up and wondering if they're crazy for questioning what everyone else seems to accept. And please subscribe to I Live to Tell for more true stories of survival, courage, and triumph over deception and adversity. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a story, because every single one of these testimonies matters. Every voice that speaks up about fraud or betrayal or injustice makes it a little bit harder for the next Victoria Ashford to get away with their schemes. Thank you for listening to my story, for believing me when I tell you that sometimes the craziest sounding truth is actually the real truth, and for being part of a community that values honesty and courage even when it's difficult. Remember that your voice matters, that your observations and instincts matter, and that speaking up even when you're terrified might be the most important thing you ever do. Until the next story, stay strong, stay vigilant, and never be afraid to stand up for what you know is right.